I think one of the favorite adages of tax professionals is that tax hits everything, right? Everything is covered, has a tax element to it. And today we are fortunate to be able to consider one of the more sobering sides of tax affecting everything, and developing an understanding of how tax law can be a part of domestic violence situations, and how the two areas of law might intersect. So for today's panel, we're lucky to have three great panel experts in this area. First is Kimberly Daly. Kimberly Daly started with Safe Harbor as an intern and volunteer. Safe Harbor is a local domestic violence relief organization. After graduation, she began working with Safe Harbor as a shelter case manager in the domestic and sexual violence emergency shelter and transitional housing in 2017 to 19. She implemented the community case manager program in the shelter in April of 2017 and was promoted to acting program manager in February 2019. Prior to coming to Safe Harbor, Kimberly was a relationship banker at Bank of America and was employed there for 18 years. She received her bachelor's degree in human services with a concentration in child and family services from the University of Phoenix in 2016. She's currently working on her master's in psychology, so she is a great expert to have here. In 2020, in July, Kimberly became the program director of the Sexual and Domestic Violence, and recently Kimberly was promoted to the director of Safe Houses, which includes human trafficking and sexual and domestic violence emergency shelters and transitional housing. So welcome, Kimberly. Thank you very much for joining us. Terry Morris, our next panelist, joined the Community Tax Law Project, the CTLP, in the fall of 2020 as a staff attorney and a Christine A. Brunswick Public Service Fellow. The American Bar Association of Taxation named Terry as one of 2 attorneys nationally to serve a 2-year term as a Christine Brunswick Public Service Fellow. And during her 2-year fellowship with CTLP, Terry is focusing on promoting CTLP's Fight Against Financial Abuse initiative, which is specifically aimed at addressing the financial issues surrounding domestic violence. Terry will be creating and building community partnerships with domestic violence partners, educating the community on financial issues domestic violence victims experience, and working directly with victims of domestic violence to resolve their income tax issues. So welcome back, Terry. It's always great to have you here in the building, even if it's just virtually.
Hello, everyone.
And our final panelist is Nancy A. Rosner. She's a senior attorney with the Community Tax Law Project. She represents low-income taxpayers in disputes with the Internal Revenue Service and the Virginia Department of Taxation at all levels of controversy, including audits, collections, innocent spouse relief, and U.S. tax court matters. Ms. Rosner also serves as the vice chair of the American Bar Association Pro Bono and Tax Clinic Committee, and she was selected to be an American Bar Association Nolan Fellow for the 2020-2021 year. So Nancy is certainly steeped in this as well. And welcome back to you too, Nancy. So thank you all for joining us today and sharing your expertise. We'll jump into the discussion here. I just want to note that we're hoping to keep this very conversational if we're able to. So feel free to raise questions at any point by using the question and answer function on the of Zoom. You can find it on the toolbar at the bottom. I'll read those questions to the panelists as they are appropriate. And we also have some time, hopefully at the end, for general questions. So welcome again, everyone. And I guess we can start. I'd love to ask Kimberly to help us understand what a typical, maybe not typical, but what a survivor or victim of domestic violence might be experiencing. And if you give me 1 second, we have some slides I'm going to put up, but I'm going to pass it to Kimberly here. So share.
Here I am. Sorry, I was having trouble.
No problem.
Getting in.
No problem, Kimberly. I've introduced you with a glowing introduction, so everybody's familiar with your expertise. But thank you so much for joining us today, and we're really looking forward to learning a lot from you and Nancy and Terry. Sorry to put you right on the spot, but I was hoping you could give us a picture of what domestic violence looks like, and sort of how it starts to intersect with the tax world.
So our clients come to us from various locations. So actually, we get all our clients through the human trafficking. I'm sorry, not human trafficking. That's different. The SDV Richmond, Greater Richmond Regional Hotline. So our survivors are then assessed for resources and assessed to see whether they're in imminent danger. Once the assessments are completed, they come to, we do our own assessments to figure out the resources that need it. When they are when they enter into shelter, we begin to work with them on a progress plan for them. And so during that plan, we figure out what needs they have. And one of those needs are really to understand their to get financial stability, because a lot of them usually don't have access to funds in their relationships and things like that. So it begins to be, we begin to learn to develop a plan with them to help them save money and things like that. We work with them and put them in contact with resources in the community. On average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically assaulted by an intimate partner in the United States. So during 1 year, these equals to more than 10 million women and men. So with that said, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have been victims of severe physical violence, beating, burning, strangulation by an intimate partner in lifetime. One particular, okay, so domestic violence based as during the COVID pandemic, our facilities had to make various adjustments dealing with COVID for our survivors. We had to adjust our intake process for them as they come into shelter. We had to adjusted our process to put them in hotel prior to bringing them into shelter so that they could be tested for the vaccine. What we realized is that domestic violence in the United States increased during that time, at least about 8.1% following the impositions of the stay-at-home orders. So during that time where they're staying at home, we saw an increase in domestic violence. However, a lot of our clients weren't able to get out to seek resources. So a lot of them had to call the hotline, and we were able to provide emotional support to them and provide them with safety plans. The lockdowns and the pandemic-related economic impacts for many of our clients, based on the fact that they were unable to work. They would have to stay home with their abuser, which made it very difficult for them to do as much as what they needed to do to survive. Many of our survivors lost their jobs if they were working, or they became more dependent on their abuser being in that situation. Domestic violence is really defined in various ways. However, the actual definition is a pattern and deliberate course of conduct designed to obtain and maintain power and control over the survivor. Over a current or former inmate, they receive the abuse is really usually received from an intimate partner, a spouse. In some cases, it's a family member, and that's considered to be family violence. Through a variety of tactics designed to instill fear and intimidation through the exercise of coercion and dominion. Domestic violence to our survivors, it's not always physical abuse. It can be verbal abuse, emotional, psychological abuse, economic abuse, childhood abuse, and abuse from third parties, physical, social, and familial isolation as well. So they're taking them from their families and isolating them from their friends in that incidents. There are domestic violence is not caused by the product of a bad or failing relationships. It is not a part of poor communication. It's not a part of consequences of a divorce or separation or custody dispute. It doesn't involve anger or substance abuse problems in some situations. it's a contributing factor, but it's not the main factor of it. Domestic violence is not only related to those in poverty. It affects various areas and various populations. Sometimes the victim can be changed or fixed. It's not something that the victim can change or fix. Sometimes they enter these, in many cases, they enter these situations and the abuser changes after a year, 3 into the relationship. So it's not anything that they know that they can expect when they enter in these relationships. It is you go back a second, thanks. The character, it is part of the character and the belief of the abuser that this is a way to control and get what they want from their survivors. When involved in abusive relationships, the abusers use for certain tactics to control the survivor and instill fear. Some of those tactics include coercion and threats, and those threats can be anywhere from threatening to kill the survivor or to commit suicide, threatening her welfare, even threatening her with charges and to make it seem like she's the abuser, and having the survivor do illegal actions. Intimidation, they use intimidation as well, threatening the survivor, gestures like bucking at them or things like that, destroying their property, using weapons, threatening their pets in certain situations. Emotional abuse is always is a main factor in domestic violence, putting the survivor down, making her feel bad about herself, making them think that their ideas are stupid and they're worthless, things like that. Anything to make them feel humiliated and less than the person that they are. They also use the tactic of isolation, isolating them from family and friends, starting to keep them from going out. They can only work a limited amount of hours, and then it can escalate to them not being able to work at all. And so in the beginning, it's like, he's very protective of me. He wants to know where I am everywhere I go. And then it becomes, the jealousy increases, and then they're unable to go anywhere without them, or they're constantly monitored. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. The abuser in some situations tend to blame the survivor for what's happening. You made me do this. This is your fault. You should have listened to me. And so the survivor begins to think that everything is happening. She brought on, she could have acted different, and maybe she could have said something. She could have spoke less, or she agitated them. So they begin to take responsibility for the abuse that they're receiving when it's not their fault. In other cases, they use their children. Children are a weapon that they use, not physically harming them, but threatening to take their children, or threatening to move away with the kids, even threatening to hurt the kids, even if they're not going to hurt them. That's what they use as a way to maintain control and instill fear into this survivor. And most importantly, economic abuse. They get to a point where if the survivor is working full time, when they meet them, they gradually try to control what they do, tell them to go part-time, they'll take care of them. And it gets down to the point where they they take their check and give them allowance out the money that they've made, or they hold their bank cards in situations like that. Also, it gets to a point where they just stop working at all, and that's controlling their finances, and they become solely dependent on the abuser. And also the last is male privilege. They treat the survivor like a slave, and they are just demanding and want their every need taken care of. And so this provides a dominant role over the women in the relationships. A lot of the main questions that you hear in domestic violence, or you statements that people make is, why did you stay? Why don't you leave? And it's not just, that's not easy for them. It's an easy statement, but it's not an easy step. survivors are again controlled emotionally. They're beat down to the point that they feel the only way they can survive is to be with the abuser. They are denied a normal life. They can only move and say things when the abuser lets them, depending on that situation. They fear others learning what they're experiencing. The shame and the embarrassment that comes with being in a domestic violence relationship is astronomical. You are embarrassed because you were once a strong woman. You are ashamed because everyone is going to know if you tell one person, and you tend to look down on yourself because you're in this relationship. Most women in domestic violence relationships, their self-esteem becomes low because of what they've been through, what they've been told, the put downs that they've endured over a long period of time. Also, in many in countries outside of the United States, domestic violence abuse is accepted. A lot of family members know about the violence and they don't do anything about it. And when they come to the United States, this is the normal practice. They accept it. And those survivors that come here, they realize that they can get out, and so they seek help with agencies such as Safe Harbor. There's also a language barrier for immigrants seeking to become United States citizens. They come and they marry a United States citizen, and their immigration status is used against them as a way to control them and instill fear. If you don't do what I say, I'm not going to file for your documents. So I'm not going to help you start your documents, or they'll start the paperwork. And whenever things doesn't go the way that the abuser thinks they should, they stop the process, or they hold the process up, or they threaten to cancel the process. And this is another way to instill fear in the survivor and to get them to do what they want them to do. Lack of money and resources. A lot of survivors stay because they don't have the money to be on their own. They fear being on their own because they've been told that they can't survive without this person, and that this individual is the only one that believes in them or that would take care of them. And so they stay because they don't have the lack of resources. They're not aware of agencies like Safe Harbor or the YWCA out there that can help them, because they're kept away from that type of environment. That's why they're isolated from family and friends, so that those families and friends cannot give them that information and help them get in contact with those resources. If the survivor has a disability, that's another way of making them think that the abuser is the only person that will take care of them. No one cares about you. I'm the only one that'll look out for you. You can only depend on me. Those are the things that they hear on a regular basis. And then the concern for their children. A lot of women stay because their children have a sort of stable environment to where they don't want to take them out their homes or have them leave their things, and they want them to maintain, just the living environment they have despite the abuse. And so a lot of women stay, and then again, they use the children as a tactic to keep the women there. And lastly, a lot of our survivors don't have anywhere to go. Some of them have been in these relationships for a very long time, which the isolation from family and friends has really affected their ability to reach out. All of these items go hand in hand, because if you put someone down and you make them think that they are unable to function or live without you, they begin to believe the lies that they're told, and they begin to believe that they can't survive without this abuser. So, and that goes right into the financial abuse that they experience. 99% of domestic violence situations have experienced financial abuse. Limits to access to household finances. A lot of our women don't even know what bills are due, when they're due, or how much they are. They don't see the bills, they don't see the money. For those, again, who work, they may not even, the only time they see their paycheck is when it's put in their hand or it goes into a bank account, but they don't have access to it because they have their bank cards. So they're given a small allowance, which is really not much, that is supposed to last them for 2 weeks. And some abusers have the survivors put everything in their name, but pay all the bills. So if they are forced to leave, or if the survivor is thinking about leaving, then they won't be able to survive without them, or at least they have them thinking they can't survive without them because they don't have a job, but they have all these bills in their name. They max out or use the survivor's bank cards for various things, with activities that don't include the survivor, or as I stated, they use their paychecks up and only give them maybe $50 for an example. Forcing survivors to, again, they hand over their paychecks, coercing them and said that, put this car in your name, I'll pay for it. And again, another way to get them to stay with them. Prevented the survivor from working or demanded they quit their job. This is a tactic that is used throughout abusive relationships. And it's another way to maintain control of that person. You take away their livelihood, the only thing they have is to depend on you for everything that they need.
Thank you, Kimberly, for that this thorough discussion of what domestic violence looks like. And it's just stunning to me how widespread it really is, and all the various tools that exist to exert this power and control over your partner in a relationship, and tools that might be surprising. And so I think tax might be one of those tools that's sort of a surprising element of domestic violence. Maybe I'll turn it over to Nancy to kind of give us a picture of how that sort of operates.
Thank you. And thank you, Kimberly, for providing that background. I think it really does help to paint the picture of how someone can end up in that situation. It might not happen all at once. It might just be these little incremental changes as the relationship goes on. And then all of a sudden, a year later, the survivor's finding themselves in a completely different relationship where they've lost a lot of control, a lot of confidence, and they're scared to leave or to move on or to upset their abuser. So, as you saw, financial abuse is a primary component in domestic violence situations. 99% involve some form of financial abuse. And then within that subset are taxes. So there are ways that taxes can be used during the relationship. And what we see most at our clinic after the relationship as just an additional way for an abuser to try to exert control or inflict abuse on the survivor, even after they've left the relationship. Taxes can follow them for several years. So here on this slide, we have some different issues that we're going to go over. These are probably the primary ways that an abuser might be able to use taxes as a tool to issue control or abuse. Invalidly jointly filed tax returns. So if the two people are married and one spouse is the abuser and files a joint return without permission, or perhaps forces the survivor into filing a joint return, that they may then be liable for any debt owed on that return. Fraudulent tax returns using a survivor's social security number. So just completely filing a separate return, perhaps after the relationship has ended. But oftentimes during those relationships, they might get information like social security number, date of birth, other confidential personal information, and later use that against the survivor. Abusers improperly claiming children on the tax return. So that could be children that the abusers share with the survivor or not. But if they happen to get information like the social security number or the date of birth of each of the children, they can use that to then claim the children moving forward, whether or not they're eligible, which would effectively prevent the survivor from being able to electronically file their return and claim the children and get the refund. And it becomes a long, drawn out audit process. Employment related identity theft. So someone else working under the survivor's social security number, making it look like they're earning more money than they actually are. Identity theft, using a survivor's information to start a business. We've seen this more than once at our tax clinic, where they've coerced the survivor into using their social, whether it's because maybe they had legal status and the abuser didn't, or they just simply convinced them, let's start the business in your name and under your information, you do the management, I'll do the work, later leaving them holding the bag with the tax debt. And then lastly, some unexpected joint income tax balances. So a lot of times what we see in these situations are the abuser is secretive about finances. So Kimberly explained sometimes the survivor doesn't even get to hang on to their paycheck. It's put into a bank account they don't have access to. So they may not be aware of what's actually going on financially. They're trusting the abuser who's telling them everything's fine, or yes, this tax return has a balance on it, but I'll take care of it. Little do they know it's never taken care of. And years later, then the IRS is coming to them saying, you owe thousands of dollars for this old tax year, and the survivor had no idea. So we're going to go over just some of the different possible roads to relief, some tools that can be used to assist survivors. Filing separate returns, filing superseding returns, filing identity theft affidavits with the IRS to report identity theft, applying for an identity protection PIN with the IRS that can be used when you file tax returns to show that you are who you say you are. And other returns would be rejected if they didn't include the PIN. Requesting relief from joint and several liability, and then creating an IRS online services account to be able to access your own IRS information. So that's something that can be done even without assistance from a tax practitioner. If you wanted to go back and pull your information, if you were concerned about prior years and what may or may not have gone on your accounts. So on slide 12, talking about filing a separate tax return to correct a fraudulent joint return. So here we see the different elements of a fraudulent return, or how IRS may determine if a tax return that was filed is fraudulent. If one spouse forges the other spouse's signature and files without their knowledge or consent. Maybe both spouses sign, but the survivor signs under duress. That could be immediate threat, gun to their head, you need to sign this tax return, I need to get this filed. Or perhaps a history of abuse that makes them feel like they cannot question any of these financial decisions, cannot question the abuser about what's on the return, what they should be doing, and they feel forced to sign. They feel like they have no other choice but to sign. That would not constitute a valid return, even if the survivor actually physically signed the return. And then lastly, there was no tacit consent. So I think this is the part that's a little trickier. IRS looks at whether there could have been tacit consent, meaning the survivor didn't overtly say, yes, let's file jointly together, but through other factors, the IRS may determine that the survivor said, yeah, okay, let's file jointly. So they might look at things like whether the survivor had a filing requirement, and if they did file their own separate tax return. If they had a history of filing together in prior years, the IRS may presume then you're saying, no, this year is different, but the IRS looks back and says, okay, for 5 years you've been filing jointly, why is this year different? So those are some challenges that the survivor may have to overcome. Whether the survivor participated in the filing of the return. So did they provide W-2s and 1099s to be used in the tax return? So I think that can weigh against arguing that the original return was fraudulent, because if you actually participated in the preparation and the filing of the return, that's going to be a harder argument to make. But on the other side of that, if the abuser filed a return and perhaps didn't know that you had a job, maybe you split towards the end of the year, didn't know that the survivor had a job, failed to include it on the tax return, that I would argue would weigh in favor of the survivor's claim that they didn't agree to that return because it wasn't even including the income that they may have earned that year. And then the IRS may look at other things like whether there was another reason to file jointly. So were they directed to file jointly through a divorce decree? So that can weigh against the argument that the return that was being filed was fraudulent. I mean, the reason why you might want to argue that it was a fraudulent return, there can be many, especially now having to do with the stimulus payments that are based on your most recently filed return. But for a fraudulent return, if there's a balance due, and you didn't agree to the return, it wouldn't seem fair for you to be held liable for any balances owed on the return. Otherwise, IRS is going to try to collect from you if you don't make the argument that that wasn't a valid return. And we hopefully will have time to get into it, but now with the stimulus payments being issued based on your most recently filed return, if the payment's being issued based on a fraudulent return, you might even be missing out on your stimulus payment, because if, let's say, the abuser filed a joint return, included their banking information, claimed you, claimed your kids, and then they're getting the stimulus, this is an issue that we're running into, that the survivors aren't getting access to their stimulus payments in those situations.
Nancy, I had a question here. So, we normally think of e-filing as being a major convenience to taxpayers, though it strikes me that might really exacerbate some of these problems. Terry, Kimberly as well. Do you see a lot of, or maybe sort of increased level of, or lever of control through the e-filing process because it is a little easier to engage in?
Definitely. I definitely think it makes it easier for the abuser to go ahead and file a return, because they don't need to prove, that they got consent from the other spouse. I mean, if you're going to a preparer, the preparer is supposed to have the other spouse sign a form attesting to, the return and that they're agreeing to the e-filing. But if you're using software at home, which pretty much anyone can do if they have a computer and can pull it up, there's no mechanism to basically protect the other spouse and to prevent a joint return from being filed, whether it was, agreed to or not agreed to. So I definitely think it's made it a little easier in certain situations for joint returns to be filed or other returns to be filed when it would not be appropriate to do so.
Yes, I've seen, I've had clients who have gone to file their tax returns and they found out that they've already been filed without their permission.
That's a really difficult situation, because then, especially if they're depending on that refund, which, working at a low income taxpayer clinic, a lot of our clients are low income, and that one refund often will supplement maybe even a third of their annual income. And if someone else has gone ahead and filed for you or claimed your kids, so it's preventing you from e-filing, you then have to file a paper tax return, which normally would take a longer time. But now with the pandemic and the IRS still slowly moving through mail and taking longer to move through mail, that refund could be delayed months and months. And especially if the return is then being audited and you have to prove, because you're the second filer, that your return was correct, it becomes a really drawn out process. And unfortunately, then that person is left without the refund, trying to work through the IRS to get the refund. And it's because of something that the abuser did without their permission.
I have a follow-up question from the audience, and so maybe it'll probably bleed through the presentation, so I hope we're not disrupting it too much. But do you find that abusers are often sophisticated in their understanding of the tax law, or at least more so than the victim? Or are they getting their advice from somewhere, or are they just kind of moving forward trying to exercise that control?
I'm sure that in some cases they have input for others, but then there's situations where they are aware of what the tax laws are and they depend on their survivor not asking any questions when it comes to filing their taxes. And so if they're already dependent on them for financial support, then they have the upper hand and they're able to file those taxes without their permission, and they are not able to ask any questions because they fear that they will be chastised for that.
Okay, great. And I think that's a perfect answer. We definitely see, I think on a base level, just filing a return sometimes can cause a huge problem. So, you may not need to be super sophisticated to do that, but you may know that e-filing might prevent someone else from being able to file. But then, the abuse does cross all sorts of socioeconomic statuses. So someone who is more sophisticated could do more, involve all of these different tools to try to use that to get back at the survivor.
And because I will say that survivors that I have worked with, a lot of them, their husbands, you know, they have that power and control in the relationship. So they already have accountants that they've hired and work with on a yearly basis, or tax preparers. So they do have some more knowledge than the survivor would as to about how the tax laws work and how to file.
That's a great point, Terry. They may have the funds to actually have an accountant or have someone that they're working with, you know, not necessarily that the preparer is, you know, colluding with them, but because they have that professional with them, they might know more about how to use taxes to benefit themselves personally. So before I turn it over to Terry, I'm just going to touch upon superseding tax returns. So this is a tool that is important now and can be used now. But it's only important up until the due date for filing tax returns. So for this year, that was extended until May 17th, which normally it would be April 15th. But basically, even if someone has already filed a return with you listed on it, if you file a return and you state that that's your own original return prior to the due date, not including extensions, so like the normal 6-month extension that you might file for that would normally extend it to April or to October 15th. So if you're, you know, after the normal April 15th or this year, May 17th deadline, that wouldn't count. But as long as you're by the original deadline for the return, which this year they're counting as May 17th, then that return becomes your original return and the IRS will treat it as such. And it basically supersedes any return on your account for that tax year. So even if someone had filed a joint return that you didn't agree to, you can go ahead and file your own separate return and the IRS is supposed to acknowledge that. If your 3 stimulus payments have already gone out, it might not help you get back what's gone out. There may be other processes that you need to use. But if there are going to be new stimuluses coming out this year, then hopefully it would be based on your superseding return. So that might be a reason why you may want to consider advising your clients to go ahead and file a superseding return to get their information on file with the IRS, their address, their banking information, et cetera, even if a prior joint return was filed for that year. So I will turn it over to Terry then to talk about some other possible roads to relief.
Okay, so another possible road to relief is filing an identity theft affidavit. This can be done normally in one of 2 ways. That might be a survivor might be prompted to do this. One is that the IRS has reached out to you or the taxpayer and let them know that, you know, their identity has been compromised and that they should file an identity theft affidavit. The IRS could issue certain letters such as a 5071C, 4883C, 5747C. So if a taxpayer were to receive those kind of letters, that code means that the IRS is saying, hey, we've noticed some suspicious activity on your account, or using your social security number, and we want to verify your identity. So, you know, this comes into play with tax-related identity theft, which is, you know, victim had their social security number used and someone filed a fraudulent return in their name using their social and identifying information and might have claimed a refund in their name. So, you know, once this procedure, once the taxpayer reports that there was some potential identity theft, then the IRS will launch an investigation into what happened, and they will put a marker on the taxpayer's account and also possibly issue what we'll talk about next is identity protection PIN. So we can go to the next slide, talk about that. Well, this is the identity protection personal identification number. Up to this year, this was a number that was assigned to taxpayers that were victims of tax-related identity theft. Now the IRS has allowed for taxpayers to voluntarily opt in to this program. So this could be good for someone, you know, if they were in that abusive relationship, they've left, maybe they know that the abuser has some personal information, they couldn't get their social security cards out, they know the person has this information. It's a good way to add an extra layer of security to your tax return filings. So you can apply for this PIN either online at irs.gov, or if a survivor doesn't have access to a computer, they can also fill out a form 15227 and apply it over the phone to have an identity pin, IP pin, excuse me, assigned to them, which they can use. They'll get a new one every year, and they'll have to use it every year to protect their identity and possibly stop an abuser from claiming their information on a tax return.
And I think just the one important thing to add there, currently the way the program works, once you opt in, you can't opt out. So I think sometimes that may cause difficulty for a survivor who's transient and moving. And so if the IRS tries to mail them their PIN, they don't get it. They need the PIN to file the return. Otherwise the return is not going to be accepted. So I don't think it's always a clear answer, yes, get an IP PIN, but it can definitely be a really good tool, as Terry mentioned, in situations where you have a pretty good sense that the abuser might go ahead and try to file returns or use their information. Once you opt into this program, then they have to have the PIN. Otherwise, the IRS is not going to authorize the return.
Okay. So now we're going to talk about innocent spouse relief. This is relief from joint and several liability, meaning that, you know, when two people file a tax, or when there's a joint tax return filed, both spouses are responsible for any debts that are incurred because of the filing of the tax return. So they're both joint and severally liable for the tax debt. Innocent spouse relief, it falls into 3 different categories. You see the code sections here. 6015B is allowed when there's an understatement of the amount of taxable items on the on the tax return, and it is possible for a requesting spouse to get a refund. You do have to request this within 2 years of the first time the IRS tried to execute collection activities against you. 6015C also allows for understatement relief, and what that will do is basically separate out the items of liability on a tax return so that each spouse would be responsible for their own tax items. This is a little more available if the spouses are no longer married or they're not living together, they haven't been living together for the past year. Then they can also request, this might be a possible option to request relief from some tax liability that the survivor is not responsible for. But there are no refunds possible in this type of relief. 6015F is a little more in-depth. That's equitable relief. So that can relieve a taxpayer from understatement of a tax item or underpayment of relief. So enough tax wasn't, the tax was not being paid and the survivor didn't know. This kind of relief is detailed in Revenue Procedure 2013-34. And refunds are possible, and this type of relief is only considered when B or C are not possible. And you do have the entire collection statute to request the relief. The IRS has 10 years to collect on a tax debt once it's been assessed. So you would have the entire 10-year period to request equitable relief under 6015F. And just a few quick notes on that. The IRS is going to be looking to, in addition to looking at relief not being available under B or C, they might also consider the fact that there were no assets transferred between the requesting spouse and the non-requesting spouse. There was no fraud or anything as far as transferring assets, that the non-requesting spouse didn't transfer assets, to avoid tax. So the IRS is going to make sure there's no transfer, there's no fraud or schemes going on. There's also another possible route to relief if for some reason the requesting spouse cannot get equitable relief under what's called a streamlined determination. They could also possibly get relief if they're no longer married, if the tax liability would be a economic hardship to the requesting spouse, or if the requesting spouse didn't know about the items that gave rise to a tax liability. So if they didn't know, for instance, like if you're in an abusive relationship and you didn't know that your spouse was working like 2 jobs, they didn't tell you where they were going, or perhaps, you went to work and you thought they just went to 1 job during the day, didn't know they had 2 jobs and had multiple income sources. That might be another reason. So, abuse will, IRS has accounted for domestic abuse in innocent spouse cases, and it is abuse is a way, provides a way to overcome certain factors, such as, the knowledge factor, like knowing, having reason to know about the tax items. Abuse can overcome that. So even if a requesting spouse or a survivor knew that they're, about these items being left off the return, the abuse in the relationship might have prevented them from questioning the return, from, really, challenging the fact that the spouse was not reporting items because they were afraid of some sort of retaliation or abuse. It could also, abuse in a relationship can also overcome, tax items that perhaps still benefited the requesting spouse, because they didn't really have any control over whether or not they wanted, to accept certain, like a lavish lifestyle or things like that within the relationship. And even if a tax item is attributable to the requesting spouse, like for instance, the abuser might have made them, start a 401k and told them to empty out the 401k. They might have done that because they were, in that abusive relationship, and it's their own tax item, but they're still, that abuse in that relationship can overcome that issue as well. Okay, and then some privacy concerns of note when requesting innocent spouse relief. The taxpayer, it's going to be, innocent spouse relief is going to be requested on a form 8857. The non-requesting spouse, who, might be the abuser, they will receive notice that, the return is being, the request is, the relief is being requested and the return is being challenged, and they're going to have their own opportunity to participate in all the administrative processes. However, the IRS will not disclose personal information unrelated to making a determination about the relief request. So the IRS should not be releasing information such as, potentially the survivor's current address, their workplace of employment. That kind of information should not be released to the non-requesting spouse. But if you are a practitioner and you end up having to go to tax court with an innocent spouse case, just take note that certain identifying information can be made public. So, just be mindful of redacting documents and disclosing information in tax court.
I had a question for you all, Terry. So these methods of relief seem a little bit like maybe putting square pegs into round holes for survivors of domestic violence. What do you find is sort of the most effective route for your clients? I'm assuming that depends on the case, obviously, but are some tools better than, or more effective, I should say, than others?
I think it just depends on where the relationship is. I mean, if the survivor has left, if they, it does depend on case to case. I mean, if you know there's, there hasn't been any tax debts incurred in your name, perhaps just, getting the IP PIN on your account to try and prevent any possible issues down the road is a good way. But, if you do know that you're already getting, let's say, you do set up your IRS online account and you find out that you have, tax debts in your name, then, innocent spouse relief might be more appropriate for that taxpayer. So I think it really is a facts and circumstances situation. It just depends on each case.
And you can use a combination of these tools. I think, you're not limited to just one. So like Terry mentioned, you might want to get an IP PIN and get an IRS online account to check your records. If it shows balances that you weren't expecting, then maybe you also have to request innocent spouse relief. So you can use all of these tools. You're definitely not limited to, one or two at a time.
Mm-hmm. And so this brings us to the IRS online services account. Like I said, this can be set up to monitor, what's happening as far as your taxes are concerned. So a taxpayer will get access to tax return transcripts that were filed using, with their social security number. their account transcripts, which might show balances owed, or filing status, and also very importantly, wage and income, like what's being reported as income under your Social Security number. So that can be set up online at irs.gov. You see the link there. You can also call and have transcripts sent to you. But I would say you might want to get your address updated with the IRS if you're thinking about getting transcripts mailed, because they'll be mailed to the last address on file. And if that was with the abuser, you wouldn't want your transcripts to go to the abuser's home if you have moved out.
I want to just take a quick step back and note that we're getting close to the time. I'm going to open the poll. If you are looking for CLE credit, please let us know. Please respond to that poll. And I guess I'll ask the panelists if you have some sort of takeaway thoughts, and if there's any questions, please submit those now. I know we didn't get to talk too much about the EIP payment, so maybe that's something to hit on, and maybe sort of how best to interact with victims of domestic violence. I'm going to advance the slides to the end where our panelists' contact information is. If you do have any questions or would like to follow up with them, please do. But maybe we could get sort of a conclusory remarks, and as these things always go, an hour is never enough time. But again, if you like CLE, please respond to the poll, and thank you very much.
I think it is important to touch upon some of the EIP issues, because I think it is something that we're hearing a lot from survivors, their inability to access their stimulus payments. So I'll just briefly talk about that and then open it up to the other panelists as well. But essentially, the first 2 rounds of the stimulus payments, known as the EIP, because they were payments being issued in advance of the 2020 tax year or the 2021 tax year, they were based on previously filed returns. So what we were seeing were situations where survivors may have filed jointly with their abuser, even outside of abusive relationships, individuals that later got divorced, but their last return on file with the IRS was a joint return. And then the stimulus payment is going into the account or going to the address of the primary person listed on the tax return, which oftentimes we're seeing is the abuser. And then they're denying access to the survivor their portion of the stimulus, including any portions that may be allocated for the children. So now that last year has ended and we're now working to file our 2020 tax returns, our advice to survivors in that situation is to go ahead and claim the recovery rebate credit on their 2020 tax return in order to try to get the EIP that they were denied access to previously. There are some avenues for relief with the IRS, which we have yet to test because there are new procedures that they enacted at the end of last year, basically saying if you can prove that the joint return on which the stimulus was based was invalid, then they may go ahead and reissue the EIP. So if that's a situation that you find yourself in or one of your clients, and please feel free to reach out to our tax clinic or one of the other tax clinics if you're not local, to get advice or perhaps representation in order to try to get those stimulus payments to who they belong to. So I will open it up to Terry and Kim for any last minute comments.
I would just like to say that if you have a friend or family member who you suspect going through domestic violence or has disclosed to you that they are in that situation, the best way to support them is to make sure that you're listening to them, not offering any suggestions, just listen to what they're going through, help them find resources in the community, such as getting in contact with Safe Harbor. If it's any type of emergencies, please have them call the Greater Richmond Regional Hotline. That number is 804-612-6126 for assistance. And that way we will be able to assist them. But again, during those situations, try not to be judgmental, offer support, offer a way to help them as far as helping them create a safety plan and things like that. Instead of asking, why don't you leave? Help them figure out how they can leave and ways that you can be helpful to them during those times.
Okay. And I will say that we also have provided just a highlight of the important forms to use when trying to navigate the tax system with a survivor of domestic violence. Some of these forms are very useful here. We've indicated in one of our slides, such as changing your address, the forms we talked about with innocent spouse relief, injured spouse, identity theft affidavit, and refund traces if a refund was taken by an abuser. These are all possible forms that you can use to help start the process with the IRS to address these issues.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you all for being here. I know I learned a lot, and I think for me, one of the biggest takeaways is just, it breaks down a lot of stereotypes about what domestic violence is, and how even taxes, which I generally think of as a good thing, can be used as a tool of control. It's not just about physical control or physical violence. So really, anybody could find themselves involved in this kind of situation, in a relationship. So it's important to provide that relief when people seek it out. So thank you all again so much for a wonderful discussion here. And if you'd like to reach out to any of our panelists, please do. And thank you all in attendance for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.